My name is Dina Khoury. I'm professor of history and international relations at George Washington University. And I am also a member of the Academic Advisory Board of the Arab Center here in DC. So thank you for joining us today, and I welcome to the panel discussion on political and economic challenges in the Arab world. For those of you who've joined us this morning just now, there's a question and answer cards. There are question and answer cards available on the tables in front of you. You may complete and hold up your card at any time for a staff member to collect. Also, no phones. If you want to use the hashtag ACWDC2017, please do so. And so I'm introducing the speakers today. I have a very easy job. And I'm doing so in order of speaking, in order that they'll be speaking. Hani Findakly is an investment banker who has advised governments, central banks, and international institutions over the last 30 years. He was chairman and director of the Clinton Group and president of Potomac Babson. Previously, he held senior management positions on Wall Street and the World Bank, served as president of the Arab Bankers Association of North America, governor of the Middle East Institute, and director of the Arab American Bank. He has also served on the faculty of MIT and on several corporate and public boards. He is a lifetime member of the Council of Foreign Relations, and is the recipient of multiple recommendations and awards, including the Gulbenkian Foundation Award and 2009 Ellis Island Medal of Honor. Phyllis Bennis is a fellow and director of the New Internationalism Project at the Institute of Policy Studies. She serves on the National Board of Jewish Voices for Peace and helped found the US Campaign for Palestinian Rights. She works with many anti-war organizations and rights and speaks widely across the United States and worldwide. She has served as an informal advisor to several top UN officials on the Middle East and UN democratization issues. Bennis has written and edited 11 books, among them her new Understanding ISIS and the New Global War on Terror, a primer, and the 6th updated edition of her popular Understanding the Palestinian-Israeli Conflict. Najib Ghadbian is an associate professor of political science at the University of Arkansas. He is the special representative to the US for the Syrian National Coalition. His research interests include democratization and leadership in the Arab world, Syrian politics, and US Middle East relations. He has authored books, published numerous journal articles, and contributed political commentaries to the US, European, and Middle Eastern media outlets. Ghadbian serves on the boards of several think tanks and working groups, including the US Institute of Peace, Pieces the Day After Project, focusing on transition planning in Egypt. Perry Cammack is a fellow in the Middle East program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where he focuses on long-term regional trends and their implications for the US foreign policy. Prior to joining Carnegie, Cammack worked on Middle East issues as part of the policy planning staff of the Secretary of State, John Kerry. Cammack is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and the International Institute for Strategic Studies, and a part-time adjunct professor at the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University. And welcome to our panelists, and Hani, please.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman, and thanks for your kind words. Good morning, everybody. I'm going to be speaking about the economies of the region, an area that I have focused on for the last 20 or 30 years since I was at the World Bank, and continue to focus on it from a business and economic perspective. My primary focus is on the GCC and oil-producing components of the Arab economies. At the same time, I recognize that there are quite a bit of similarities and trends within the Arab economy, even for the non-oil producing economies. They tend to have similar features. Public sector dominates, government relies on small number of resources, unemployment is very high, skill level and productivity is pretty low, and they tend to follow the same economic cycles, whether they're oil producers or non-oil producers, with a few months leaks and lags, and that's a trend that has prevailed for the last 40 to 50 years. The differences, of course, is that most of the non-oil economies tend to rely on domestic labor as compared to the oil-producing economies, or many of them, especially in the GCC countries, tend to rely on foreign labor, and that difference has a little bit of an implication to the current phase of the economy. So just where are we now in the Arab economy? We all read and know about the conflicts that the region is embroiled in. And I can tell you that looking deep into the economies of the region, the challenges that the region faces are just as complex and in fact associated with and may end up aggravating the current formidable challenges that they face on the political and the social level. This time, the region has faced a number of these challenges and has gone through cycles. This time, I argue, is going to be different. It's different because the changes that and the challenges the region faces are a result of technological disruptions that are massive and are irreversible. That disruption has occurred across all economic sectors in the region. Started out with the with the energy industry. This year, as you all know, marks the 10th anniversary of the introduction of the iPhone. Tomorrow morning, iPhone 10 will go on sale in the US market. It's been only short 10 years, and very few of us don't know what life was without a smartphone or before a smartphone. Since then, Apple has sold over a billion and a half iPhones. Smartphones are expected within the next couple of years to probably be in the hands of 90% of every man, woman, and child on this planet. So the disruption that the iPhone has done for the communication industry, for the internet, for access to media, for picture taking, is amazing. In 1990, early 90s, there was a projection that because of the rise of the emerging economies and the rise of the middle class in the world, that the number of pictures being taken would be 10 times of what it was in 1990, within a decade. The projection was absolutely wrong. It was actually an order of magnitude higher, 100 times. But the price of Kodak stock went from $90 in 1990 to $2 today because we take pictures and do things differently. The similar stuff has happened in the energy industry, and it hits like a tsunami on all fronts. It hit on the production side, it hit on the consumption side, and it hits on the way we use transport and energy. We all know about fracking. In the last 15 years, the US has increased its production of energy products by 5 million barrels per day, actually 5.5 million barrels a day from what it was in 2000. This is the equivalent of the collective production today of Kuwait, Oman, and the UAE and Qatar combined. Just think of the massive change that has taken place. Lots of changes have taken place in other areas, the most important of which is declining consumption. Declining consumption was a result of two factors. One is improved in the way we consume, conservation, battery uses, variety of self-driving cars. That has actually, for the US, which is the largest consumer per capita in the world, has reduced its per capita consumption over the last 15 years, 17 years, by 20%, close to 20% per capita. There is a think tank in California called Rethink X, which focuses on new innovation in transportation. It argues that by 2030, same year as Saudi Arabia has its own vision of transformation in that year, that it estimates that in the US, 95% of the passenger miles that we will be driving as Americans will be made by car shares, ride shares, and by automotive and electric vehicles, and will all be supplied by fleets, Uber-like, than individual ownership of cars. That itself, they estimate that there will be a decline of another 30% in energy consumption in this country. So the region faced those challenges, and it was a bit slow in reacting to it. They first argued that this is another cycle. We've seen oil prices go up and down, and stubbornly refused to face the reality that this is a permanent change and it's an irreversible change. So they increased production in the hope that they will drive the fracking industry in the United States out of business. They didn't. To put this in context, between 1910 and 1999, there were roughly about 70 to 80 US companies that produce the majority of oil and gas and coal in the United States. By the year 2015, there were 3,000 companies. Think of the numbers, from 80 to 3,000. The CEO of these companies were going to bed every night, not knowing whether they will be in business the next morning, and they start the morning business day, not knowing whether they will be in business by the end of the day. So their actions, their reactions were quite different than if you're a chief of a large oil company who will survive regardless, especially a national oil company who will survive regardless of what happens. That brought about efficiency, innovation, and change in the way they do business. And that accounts for the 5 million plus increase in production that I had referred to earlier. The region responded ultimately to those challenges by doing a number of things. The most prominent and the most known response is the Saudi Arabian Vision 2030 that basically included a menu of options, cutting spending, reducing public employment, and raising fees and taxes on both foreign and local workers and companies, and introducing new fees and cutting subsidies in a big way. That vision and a plan in itself is a welcome sign, and it's promising things, but it lacks a number of problems, and it's beginning to face the kind of issues that many of us who looked at this plan anticipated before. The first thing is that it goes against economic orthodoxy. When your economy is slowing down, you don't raise taxes, cut spending, and fire people. Second problem they have is that they cannot address, and they have not addressed, the fact that labor participation in the country is very low. It's 30%. It's about half of the international average, and labor productivity is pretty low. Just to put this in perspective, it costs an average of about $45,000 to hire a worker in Saudi Arabia. That's average for the entire sector. That average worker in Saudi Arabia produce only $41,000 in goods and services. The plan that they have is to increase the number of local workers and reduce the number of foreign workers. Now, the problem is this, that a foreign worker costs 20% less and produces 20% more than a local worker. So that gap that had been prevalent for a long time and has been covered by the fact that there was a lot of cash and a lot of money flowing in, will become bigger and more serious, that will aggravate any kind of implementation of the plan. The plan is also heavily loaded with transactions. The most famous of which, of course, is the Aramco IPO. I've looked at that, and I've seen that it's going to raise a number of problems. There was a company called Alibaba, many of you are familiar with. Alibaba listed in the New York Stock Exchange because it was the largest place to list, although it's primarily a Chinese company. Within a year, they were hit with at least 30 subpoenas from the SEC, asking for disclosure of information that I think will make Aramco very uncomfortable in disclosing. Finally, the plan has unintended consequences. I just came back from Saudi Arabia, short visit, and found that the region is already, and the big cities are already beginning to suffer from vacancies as foreign workers depart. There's an estimate that over the next 18 months to 24 months, between 2 and 2.5 million foreign workers and their families, or their families, will be leaving the country. That creates a huge amount of vacancies and create obviously a spillover effect on real estate and on the economy. To be short, and my chairman has just given me a sign that I have only a couple of minutes left, so let me cut to the chase. There is an economic version of economic crisis called the Minsky moment. Chinese governor of central bank just mentioned that this week, and I chose to use it in my presentation. It's a moment in which asset prices, real estate, stocks, you name it, collapse. And the collapse of asset prices brings about a very major consequences to the economy. Mexico experienced that in 1982, you may recall. Japan experienced that in 1990, and still it has not yet recovered from it. Asia experienced it in 1997, Russia in 1998, and we know about the US tech bubble in 2001 and the large decline in the economy in 2007, 2008 after Lehman collapse. This could also bring about another very negative consequences, which is the potential devaluation of the GCC currencies, which have been, for the last, since they were issued, been pegged to the US dollar. That will have very serious political, social, and obviously economic consequences. I don't have a lot of time to discuss them, but I'll be happy to address them at a later time. How do you avoid such calamities, and what do you do under the current circumstances? Frankly, the options are fairly limited. There's a paucity of options that the region has, but probably the most important one in the near term to avoid a collapse of asset prices is the need to balance very delicately the action of cutting spending and raising taxes with stimulating the economy so that it can pick up the slack that the government will have. But the bottom line is that the welfare model that the region has had for the last 50 years, has enjoyed for the last 50 years, is gone, it's finished. It's a question of what is going to replace it and whether or not we're going to have a more balance between public and private sector. But the rentier economy and the welfare model is finished. I thought about the fact that I'm painting a very negative picture, and it is, and it's very hard to avoid it. But I also thought that there might be some silver lining. And what is a silver lining? And there are two things that I thought would give some hopeful expectation to the region. One is the fact that this crisis and the end of the welfare model, while will have political, social, and economic consequences, it will also bring some positive ones. It will force people into work. It will force governments into adopting measures to create the enabling condition for a modern economy to produce and compete, and will increase the productivity of the labor. Finally, the big issue for the region is roughly about 400 million Arabs across Middle East and North Africa. At current rate of growth, they're projected to grow to about 800 million within 35 years, and double again by the year 2085 to 1.6 billion people. That's a hell of a lot of people that will overwhelm America, Europe, and be on par with China and India as sort of the three largest sort of blocks. And although it's not one block, but it is a block that shares a lot of cultural, social, and other things, and it's a block of consumers that's very powerful. How they behave and how they ultimately begin to be a part of the global economic competitive system is one that holds a little bit of hope that the region maybe, if you take a slightly longer term outlook, may be in for better times. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Dina. Thank you, Hani, for this. Thank you all for being here, and thanks to the Arab Center for organizing it. I don't have any good news either. I'm going to talk about Trump and the Arab world, which is pretty disastrous. But I think we should be clear that it's not all new. The disaster predates Trump. He has made it qualitatively, not only quantitatively, worse, and that's important. But it is important to keep in mind what is historic continuity and where there are breaks in that continuity. I would disagree with one point from this morning, that I think we have to be very cautious in making claims about Trump's isolationism. The only isolationism I see is the isolationism of diplomacy. There's no isolationism on the military side. This is a thoroughly militarized set of policies. As incoherent as they are, the one point of coherence is the focus on the military. You have a cabinet that is grounded in billionaires and generals who have the dominant interest and the dominant influence. The so-called grown-ups in the room are mostly generals, a couple of gazillionaires in there too. But these are not people who have a view of building an internationalist foreign policy that is grounded in human rights, centrality of the United Nations, and equality for all, just as a possibility of how we might see a different kind of foreign policy. The policy of the United States in the region right now is dominated by the global war on terror. That's not new, but it is indeed escalating across the region. The US has been at war with terrorism for 16 years now, and frankly, terrorism is doing pretty damn well. Terrorism is thriving, because that old claim that President Obama taught us over and over again, there is no military solution, happens to be true. There is no military solution. You can accomplish certain discrete things with the military. They end up almost every time having a much more negative medium and long-term impact than whatever the short-term gain might be. That is not a lesson that has been learned. With ISIS across the region losing territory and losing control of people, obviously a very good thing for those people, but the claim that this is somehow liberation, when we are talking about the utter demolition of entire cities, the old saying that comes from the Vietnam era, we had to destroy the village in order to save it, pales in the face of the destruction of entire cities, entire swaths of countries, far beyond what ISIS has done or what US opponents have done in cities like Aleppo, with the destruction of Aleppo by Russian and Iranian and Syrian forces. But the US forces have been doing this as a matter of course across the region, and we are now seeing whole countries facing this kind of devastation. What's new is not only the escalation, what's new is also a level of recklessness in this policy that almost publicly prides itself on not taking into account medium to long-term impacts and focusing only on the immediate. This is a president and an administration that has chosen quite proudly war over diplomacy, to choose guns over butter, with no apology, no sense that there might be a price to be paid for such a choice. You see it in the financing, in the economic side. When you look at what was the budget that this president asked Congress, when he wanted a $54 billion escalation in the military budget, and remember, this is just the military budget that doesn't even include Veterans Affairs, doesn't include the nuclear arsenal, and ironically, doesn't even include the wars. It just basically includes keeping the lights on at the Pentagon. He wanted $54 billion additional. Congress, of course, gave him almost $85 billion, but we won't go there for the moment. But that money was taken from what I would argue are the agencies and possibilities of the US government that actually make us safer, as opposed to the military that ends up putting us at greater risk. So when you strip $30 billion, 30% of the budget of the State Department, how do you even think you could in the future have diplomacy, because you don't have any diplomats left? This is a serious problem. We have seen differences in the rhetoric, certainly. President Obama's speech in Cairo chose a different message to the people of the Middle East, not least that he spoke to people. He didn't speak to the kings and the rulers and the bankers, sorry, not bankers like you, but bankers. He spoke to college students, to young people, to ordinary people. Now, he didn't keep most of his promises, let's be clear, but he posed the possibility of what a different policy could look like. And when we look at the legacies of the Obama administration in foreign policy, the legacies of success are those where diplomacy won out over war. So the environmental deal in Paris, the moves towards normalization of relations with Cuba, these are all things that Obama will be given great credit for. And most important of all, the hard-fought victory for diplomacy with Iran, the Iran nuclear deal. Where we will see failure in the Obama legacy is every place where he chose to use military rather than diplomacy, sometimes reluctantly, sometimes aggressively, but in every case, there was nothing close to the level of focus, the level of investment, of time, of money, of high-level attention to diplomacy as there was to the military side. So he failed in Libya, he failed in Syria, he failed in Iraq, failed in Yemen. Everywhere that the US military has been so active, there has been failure. And I think now we're seeing, in a sense, a more matching failure between the actual policy and the rhetoric. The rhetoric was pretty clear. This is all about money and the military. And I think that's what we're seeing in effect. When Trump went to Saudi Arabia for his speech, he did not talk about building a community of Arab nations that the US would be supportive of. He did not talk about human rights, as we know, not for the Saudis, not for Qatar, not for any of the countries in the region, not for the UAE, not for any of the myriad violations, let alone Israel's violations. He talked about building a coalition against Iran. That was the focus, and that remains, in many ways, the framework of the strategy that's being followed. We see that in the two crown princes, if you will, MBS and Jared Kushner, the two crown princes that have become a kind of, brotherhood of crown princes, in a very dangerous way, focusing on Iran as the key danger in the region. The decision of the Trump administration to join the Saudi effort in the long-standing competition between Saudi Arabia and Iran for regional hegemony, in which the US has supported the Saudi side for a long time. That's not one of the new ones. But what is new is the engagement with it militarily. So what we see in Yemen, where the US is not just selling hundreds of billions of dollars to the Saudis to make their military more capable. They are doing that. They are also flying the planes with US planes, US pilots, doing the refueling of those bombers so they can bomb Yemeni civilians more efficiently. That's on us. That's our war. This is not just the US enabling somebody else's war. This is the US fighting that war. And what we see are these massive levels of escalations in all of the wars across the region, mostly as a result, ultimately, of the US invasion and occupation of Iraq. We won't even talk about the devastation of Afghanistan. We're focusing on the Arab world. But the so-called global war on terror, the answer to the great crime of the September 11 attacks, the decision of the Bush administration immediately to say we will answer this crime as if it had been not a crime but an act of war, and we will answer it by taking the world to war. This is the same wars that we are now seeing playing out so horrifically across the region. It has given power and legitimacy to some of the worst human rights violators across the region, from Syria to Saudi Arabia and beyond. In Qatar, we'll see whether any of the New Deal around labor rights becomes real or whether it's one more rhetorical gimmick. We don't know yet. But in all of these arenas, people are paying an enormous price for these wars. You can't have a foreign policy that's based on going to war against terror because you can't destroy terrorism militarily. It's not just a slogan. You know, you can't bomb terrorism out of existence. You can bomb cities, you can bomb people. Once in a while, you might get lucky and actually bomb a terrorist, somebody who actually was responsible for the deaths by violent attack of civilians for a political purpose, the classic definition of terrorism. Sometimes you might get lucky. But chances are pretty good that even on those rare occasions when you get lucky, and maybe you were really lucky and didn't kill 10 times as many civilians surrounding that terrorist as the terrorists themselves, but you can be pretty sure that even on those rare occasions when you get lucky, the people around that person probably don't think they're a terrorist. They may not like what they did. They may think it was sort of wrong, but in most cases, they're not going to be so happy about planes from another country coming in and killing more people to take them out. So you can't really go after terrorism militarily. The problem is the alternatives, which have to do with diplomacy, which have to do with humanitarian support, which have to do with more diplomacy and more diplomacy. In that context, you have to invest a level of money and high-level attention, understanding that you're not going to get much credibility for it. You're not going to get a lot of time on TV. It's not sexy. It's not, boy, look at those beautiful bombs, as we heard. You're not going to get any of that. It's hard. It takes a really long time, but it's the only option that we have. If we talk just briefly, I want to just touch on Israel-Palestine for just a moment, because here we're seeing one of the exceptions to the generals calling the shots here. We're talking about some pretty ignorant people being given the preeminent positions to call the shots. The one who's not very ignorant, I would say, is Ambassador Friedman. He's not ignorant, but he supports the most dangerous, the most reactionary segment of the right wing of Israeli politics, and that's a very high bar, because Israeli politics has moved so far to the right, as I think all of you know, that Bibi Netanyahu represents the left wing of his cabinet. And that's a very serious threat when we're talking about a nuclear weapons state. That's a very serious threat. But when you have a US ambassador who has historically supported things like moving the embassy to Jerusalem, that's a very dangerous moment of support for that kind of extremism. And finally, I want to just focus on one point about what happens when these wars come home, because this is where we see the utility of the rise in racism in the United States, and particularly the rise of Islamophobia. Islamophobia is not new to the United States. It has a long and sordid history in this country. But the reason that it's on the rise so dramatically now, and the reason it's been on the rise since, I would argue, 1978 at the time of the Iranian Revolution, has everything to do with supporting US wars. Because how do you convince young American kids to be willing to go off and fight against people in a country they can't even usually find on a map, other than by convincing those young people, those young soldiers, that these are people who are not worth living? That what we want from them is our oil, as President Carter, before his change, as he was a much better ex-president than he ever was a president, I'm afraid. But when he talked about our oil under the sands of the Persian Gulf, it was like, how did our oil get under their sand? Nobody ever asked that question at the time. But if you want young people in this country to be willing to go to war against people across the world, sand and oil or not, you have to convince them that they don't deserve to live. So you have to start with the Islamophobia at home. You can't wait till you get there. And that's why we're seeing the rise, the publicly endorsed, White House embraced kind of vicious Islamophobia and deadly racism that we're seeing from this administration. If we are serious about protecting refugees, and God knows we should be, we have to start with stopping the wars that create refugees in the first place. Thank you.
Thank you for the Arab Centers, for our chair. I'll try to build on the previous presentations and address Trump and Syria in particular. One thing I could guarantee you can't be hopeful when you talk about Syria, especially with this administration. I will do that in 3 sections. First, to ask the question whether there is a new strategy towards Syria. What are the forces, factors influencing the administration thinking about Syria and the prospect for the future? First point, to ask the question whether there is a strategy. I'm afraid that it's hard to expect that people who are in this town in charge of policy know anymore the definition of a strategy. I mean, not only toward the Arab world, but toward all foreign policy issues. On Syria, there's so far really no clear vision or even clear policy towards Syria. If we look at the different statement, the one thing that's clear is maybe the contradictory objectives they set regarding Syria. Having digged through all of the statements made by the members of the administration, I could identify maybe some ingredients that can form a strategy towards Syria. The first of which is the goal of defeating Daesh, ISIS. That's definitely something that continues to be the highest priority for this administration, something they inherited from the previous administration. And this is, good and bad. The good thing, again, is the administration working with others have achieved some progress on that regard, but there's no clear, again, vision what's next. And the cost has been very high, as Phyllis said, to do so. In the last few months, in the war in Syria, the multiple level of wars, the most victims have been, in fact, killed by the alliance, led by the US, in places like Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor and elsewhere. So that's, I think, is something, a theme that we could see going through all of those objectives, the contradictions. In order to achieve defeating ISIS, the administration found itself allowing more maybe room for Iran and its militias in Syria, which is their second objective in Syria, containing Iran. Has been something that the president, since he was the candidate for the position, articulated very clearly that he is not happy with, of course, the Iran deal, with the Iranian influence in the region. But again, I'm afraid here too is that he's targeting the positive thing about the deal, which is maybe postponing Iran going nuclear, but not addressing directly containing Iran's influence in places like Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. So by pursuing, again, the war against Daesh, they sent messages that they would allow more role for the pro-Iranian militia, which are in fact leading the effort in places like Deir ez-Zor and elsewhere in eastern Syria. A third objective that's been not only articulated, but there was actually an action on that one, which is preventing the regime from further use of chemical weapons. And I think that's the only positive things that we've seen. So with all of the red lines being violated during the Obama administration, at least this time when Assad used sarin against Khan Sheikhun, there was a retaliation. So Assad now has 59 reasons not to use chemical weapons against his people. But he's continuing to use barrel bombing. He continues to use all other weapons, to kill Syrians, despite, again, the effort of even, the Russia to reach some de-escalations in that country. The other objective that's been articulated by members of the administration is to contain the conflict, not to find a final solution for the conflict. And I think that's the weakness of both the Obama and the Trump administration thinking about Syria. Not to think about it, not to look at the root causes of the conflict, which is Assad atrocities, which produced Daesh and the refugees problems and caused all of the other issues. So the administration's been dealing with the symptoms, the outcomes, of the crisis rather than the root causes of the conflict. The forces that we see influencing the current thinking about Syria within the administration, I would see the first one as being the continuity of the policy from the previous administration. Despite all the rhetoric, we see actually more continuity than change. The only change, again, that can be expected is how to deal with Iran. And we've heard clearly from Ambassador Nikki Haley, who's been the most articulate, I think, within the administration about Syria, that the administration will not tolerate the Iranian influence, particularly the Hezbollah and other militias in Syria. So putting this, I think, as an objective and a priority would be something positive and a shift. Despite, you mentioned some of the successes of the Obama administration in regarding the Arab world, the Muslim world, and I agree with some of those. But for Syrians, Obama was the worst thing that happened to Syria. Because he said all the right things, but he did not do anything to advance those good things, including, the Assad must go, including finding a political solution, including the protection of civilians, which I think could have been one thing that can be achieved without full military invasion. Second factor, I think, is the institutional factor in the making of the U.S. Policy towards Syria within the administration, and maybe if we could find any role for Congress in the making of this policy. The administration has been, if you want to describe it in a most positive way, very dysfunctional, as we've seen. And I think as it becomes more solidified, I think we see a role for the generals in the making of the foreign policy and the billionaires. And those are the same one, and I think that's a good thing. I mean, at least the Flynn and the Bennin are no longer there, so that's positive. But we still don't see who's in charge. I mean, who's making the policy. I mean, we have the commander-in-chief, the diplomat-in-chief. It's hard really to see him setting the tone for that, and I think that's going to be a factor for the foreseeable future. Another factor, I think, influencing the policy is the role of different maybe allies in the region who's trying to capitalize on the administration desire to contain Iran, and whether they can influence the making of the policy or not. I think one of the most important factors that likely to maybe determine how this administration is going to go on Syria is to resolve the conflict between the two objectives of containing Iran from one hand and working with Russia on the other hand in Syria. This is something we've seen Mr. Trump repeatedly expressed liking and enchantment with Putin and his style and his policies and his way of doing things. And Mr. Putin is responsible for most of the atrocities, at least since 2015, in Syria, in addition to Iran and, of course, Assad. So how is he going to resolve that, this kind of contradiction between the two? I think the two, Iran and Russia, are likely to continue to work together, to advance and keep Assad in power, while the U.S. and the other side, the friends of Syria, have not done enough. What can be expected, I think, based on this analysis is really hard to say. But I think one thing at least, and that is to advance the objective of ending the conflict, stopping the killing in Syria. I do see some positive things in what Russia had done in terms of de-escalation. But Russia is trying to derail the finding a solution to Syria by making Astana replace, and I think Minister Mitri said this morning, to replace Geneva. I would see that the U.S. administration can take a political leadership, at least in keeping the focus on finding a political solution in Syria. That is, the essence of which is a political transition based on 2254, based on the Geneva Communique, and that's the only solution. Syria will not have any prospect for a solution, will not defeat Daesh, will not deal with the external militias that are in the country as long as the main cause stays in power, and that is Assad. Thank you.
Great. Thanks first to Dina and Khalil and Arab Center and the organizers for this fantastic conference. As someone that played a very small role in debating some of these issues inside the Obama administration, I'm going to resist the obvious temptation to kind of unleash on the Trump administration, in part because I think the critique is self-evident, and in part because I think some of my colleagues have articulated it quite well. Instead, what I thought I would do is look at some of the, I would say, structural impediments that help to explain the lack of coherence in the U.S. response. I mean, pick your date, really, if you want to say since 9/11, since the Arab Spring, spanning multiple administrations, both Democratic and Republican. Really, I would say since the first Bush administration, which I think did have a fairly coherent integration of their kind of political, diplomatic, and security objectives. And I'm going to start by really reminding people of the title of this panel, which is Political and Economic Challenges in the Arab World Today, which I think actually holds, subtly maybe, some insight into some of this dysfunction. And it's the word today, because the word today suggests if we were having this discussion yesterday, maybe the political and economic challenges would be different. If we were having the discussion tomorrow, maybe the political and economic challenges would be different. And if we were having the discussion the day after that, they might be different yet again. And that really gets to the nature of the kind of constant bombardment of crises. So one day we're talking about Doha and the GCC crisis. The next day we're talking about the humanitarian catastrophe in Yemen. The next day we're talking about Libya or violence in Jerusalem. I think we've heard from this panel quite eloquently that there's a number of different ways that we could imagine defining U.S. interests in the Middle East. There is, I think this administration, it's fair to say, defines the interests quite narrowly in terms of security concerns, counterterrorism, nonproliferation, et cetera. And, from my perspective, these are very real concerns. We could define them more broadly in terms of economic interests. Certainly oil security and other things would fit in that. Or we could go even further still and include some of the value issues that were discussed earlier in terms of democratic governance, human rights, political pluralism, which I think many of us would argue actually undermine or undergird, rather, many of the security challenges we face in the region. But no matter how you define these interests, as someone who has at least modest experience working in U.S. government trying to confront these issues, I think it's hard to escape the reality that the tension between this nonstop kind of barrage of crises overwhelms, or has overwhelmed, at least over the last 15 or 20 years, kind of efforts to promote these American interests, however you define them. So from my perspective, what are the U.S. interests facing, or what are the priorities facing in the Middle East, facing the region today? I would articulate two, and then in closing kind of try to bring it back to what I see as our longer term priorities. The first is what to do, and Najib talked about this a bit, what to do about Iraq and Syria in the aftermath of what appears to be an imminent military defeat of ISIS, although clearly not the end of the terrorism threat, and frankly not the end of the Islamic State either. Now, I agree actually with Phyllis's statement that undermining a lot of this violence are essentially collapse of catastrophic collapse of kind of governance, lack of respect for human rights, and et cetera. I also agree that there aren't military solutions to the Iraq and Syria challenges, but I would say, even as someone that opposed the war in Iraq and has generally resisted the idea of U.S. military intervention in Syria, now that the U.S. military is in Iraq and Syria, it actually is important to continue a limited U.S. military presence, basically to keep to prevent the emergence of, whether you want to call it the Islamic State 2.0, Al Qaeda 3.0, et cetera. So that's one issue, is how to deal, putting aside even the issue of the Syrian civil war, the issue of how to, now that there has been some tactical success in countering the Islamic State, how to turn that into some lasting progress. The second is what to do about Iran, and that includes, of course, there's a non-proliferation component of that, as well as dealing with whatever one thinks of them, Iran's regional policies. Now, the first aspect of this would be the nuclear file. From my perspective, of course, the nuclear file is the one area in the bilateral relationship where there's actually been demonstrable progress. So the idea that the United States would kind of walk away, undermine the agreement, at this point, to me, is folly. Although it's not exactly clear that that's what the Trump administration is trying to do. To this point, I think the non-certification of the JCPOA, essentially at this point, is a political, a domestic political issue, although it's one that I think quickly could cascade into an unraveling of the agreement. But then there's the issue of what to do about Iran in the region, which I see as another priority for the United States. Now, I'm not one that thinks that Iranian influence in Syria or in Iraq or in Yemen in and of itself is necessarily a threat. However, when you do look at Iranian support for non-state actors, threat to U.S. partners in the region, the kind of undermining of the regional order, that is problematic. And I think the U.S. does need to think carefully about how to respond to that problematic behavior. But we also, I think, need to be, there's talk now of rollback of Iran in the region. I think we need to be clear-eyed about the sources of Iranian, sources and nature of Iranian influence in the region, and frankly, the U.S. Ability to counter those sources. And in part, I mean, let's think about Hezbollah in Lebanon. The U.S. has been determined to weaken Hezbollah for 3.5 decades in Lebanon, and during that, through sanctions and other means, and during that period, the organization has essentially grown from a clandestine terrorist organization to a political movement that is dominant in Lebanon and arguably one of the most competent military forces in the region. So clearly the old playbook of sanctions, political pressure hasn't worked, or it hasn't worked the way we'd like. So anyway, those are two issues that I would put on the table, kind of post-ISIS and Iran. But let me end by kind of bringing it back to where I began, which is this kind of tension between our immediate priorities and our kind of longer-term interests. And I think it's clear that in both of these cases, whether it's the emergence of ISIS or the expansion of Iranian influence in the region, both of them are fundamentally rooted in profound socioeconomic and political deficiencies in the Arab state. And in fact, I'll even go further than that and really describe or claim, make the claim that essentially what's happening in the Arab world is an unraveling essentially across three different dimensions, the dimension of the kind of citizen, of the state, and of the region. And what I mean by that is, I mean, I think in 2011 we saw very clearly that the kind of social contracts prevalent in most countries, Hani referred to renterism and the end of renterism, these old social contracts based on kind of authoritarian bargains, I think are clearly a thing of the past. They no longer hold. In terms of the second level, or the institutional level, in response to that, the turbulence that's happened, I think we've seen a kind of unraveling in country after country, either fraying or someplace utter collapse of the political institutions. And then in terms of the third layer of fracturing, which I'm describing, is really the regional layer. The fact that rather than states as coherent actors, we now have transnational movements, we're dealing with sectarian rivalries, we're dealing with geopolitical conflicts, whether between US and Russia, or Iran and Saudi Arabia, or inter-GCC. So all this is a long way of saying that you know, I think policymakers have a fundamental challenge. They've got these crises burning in their inbox, which require immediate attention. But the flip side of it is, until policymakers, and I think this is a theme maybe across several of the panelists here, until policymakers find a way to develop tools, both in the region and internationally, to deal with some of these underlying deficiencies, I'm afraid that we're going to be kind of spinning in this hamster wheel for quite some time.
Thank you to our panelists. We have a few questions for you. The audience has a few questions for you, and I'm wondering if we can take, since we started 10 minutes late, can we take 10 minutes extra? No? Okay. Who are the organizers? 5 minutes? Okay, so the most general question, I think, for all of the panelists, and it's more directly corrected to you, Perry, is can peace and democratic development and economic growth take place in the region without a regional security framework that includes Iran? And I'm wondering if all of you would like to answer this as briefly as possible, so we can get to other questions.
I'll take a very quick stab at this. I mean, fundamentally, we have kind of 4 civil wars, obviously, Yemen, Libya, Syria, Iraq. And as long as these civil wars are kind of burning, I think those overwhelm any kind of efforts at economic and political reform. And I think, you know, these all started as local conflicts and have kind of developed into regional conflicts, every one of them. And until you kind of, I don't necessarily think you need regional solutions, but what you need to do is to create the space for local solutions. And that does require, I think, ultimately engaging Iran and finding a way to find some kind of accommodation with Iran.
Phyllis, you want to grab it?
Yeah, briefly, I would say, first of all, I think there's at least 11 separate wars in Syria alone. So I think there's a lot of wars being waged here. I do think that there is a serious regional problem, but there's also a huge problem of the overarching influence, in my view, a very bad influence of the United States, militarily, politically, economically, and in every other way. If we look just at the question of the Iran nuclear deal, what the US is trying to do, and has for years, is trying to create processes for non-proliferation while ignoring its own obligations for disarmament. That's an inherently unstable reality that's not going to last very long. And I think ultimately there's going to have to be a grand bargain, as Iran offered back in 2002, with the United States at the time, and the Bush administration said, no, in fact, we're going to call you the axis of evil instead. But some version of that is going to have to be part of it. But I think that when we look at the question of what it's going to take to deal with these conflicts, it's true that they all have local roots, but they all also have links to the existing instability that at the moment is grounded in the U.S. Invasion and occupation of Iraq. That's what gave rise to ISIS. That was the creation of ISIS, was during and in response to the U.S. occupation. So, I think that we have to look at that and look at the difference between what the U.S. owes the region in terms of reconstruction, reparations, compensation, which is an enormous bill, and what we don't owe, which is maintaining military troops and military support in the region, which is furthering the instability that's already underway.
Okay. So there are a couple of questions that are specific, one to Najib and one to Hani, and I'm going to ask them and ask you to respond as briefly as possible to them as well. Hani, the question is about the GCC countries who seem predisposed, that the person is asking, to ride out the negative effects of the current blockade. But is there a strong economic reason for quick settlement of the crisis for all countries? And let me ask Hani's second question so you can pick it up right after that. Hani, what is the approximate bill, the price for Syria's rebuilding? And who will be doing that, do you think?
You're asking me?
Yes, no, Najib. So Hani, you go ahead with the...
I assume that the question relates to the blockade of Qatar by the other GCC countries. If you have missed it, there was a very good article yesterday in the Financial Times, a full-page article on the UAE and how it has transformed itself from a goodwill sort of state trying to live in peace and security with other countries with a whole new attitude. As more proactive, interventionist, aggressive attitude. All of these things, and looking at the solutions of the crisis, reminds me, I don't know if you remember the I Love Lucy show, and it's now coming in different languages, and my Chinese friends now watch it and enjoy it. There's an episode that has always stuck in my mind as I use it as an example of how Arabs respond to issues. Ricardo walks into the room and sees Lucy's on fours looking for something, and he says, "What are you doing?" And she says, "Well, I've lost one of my earrings, and I'm looking for it." So he's trying to help her look for it, and he says, "Did you lose it here?" She said, no, I lost it in the bedroom. So why are you looking here? She says, because the light is much better in the living room. That to me sort of epitomizes the way the region deals with its problems, and I think I will never admit to knowing exactly what the forces that have, for example, started the boycott of Qatar, or before that the war in Yemen, but it's always looking for solutions in the different places to different problems, and I doubt very much that this time around it's going to be any different. Just to give you an idea about my own estimate of the economic impact of the crisis, Qatar will probably suffer the most of the GCC countries as a result of that. And I estimate the net effect over, say, 3 years, probably a 5% of GDP. Having said that, other countries will suffer too. Qatar has about 300,000, for example, workers from Egypt who are vulnerable for any kind of decline in the economy and the need for example, expat workers. The net impact for the other GCC countries, particularly Saudi Arabia and the UAE, probably is 1 to 2% of GDP. It's about a third less than on Qatar, but because of the larger size of the economies, their overall dollar impact or local currency impact will probably be comparable and significant.
Najib?
You know, the numbers keep increasing, of course, the cost of reconstruction, but I've seen different figures. The figure of 150 to 200 billion dollars is not unrealistic. I think one of the positive things that we've seen during the General Assembly annual meeting late September was some of the Europeans were trying to push for stabilization and reconstruction. And at least the US position, in addition to France, Britain, others, was we should not reward the Assad regime, Russia and Iran, and connect reconstruction, a position we take, with political transition. But even in those areas outside the regime's control, there is a potential to begin that process. Again, I think without a political solution, none of the major countries, US, Europeans, Gulf countries, would really invest in that process. But I think that's why there is a need, necessity to focus on the political solution first.
Thank you. Please join me in thanking our panelists and